Northern Maine, 1899. While neighbors raced to stockpile cordwood before the brutal cold hit, Jean-Baptiste Leblanc was still hammering boards across his porch in late January. They called it wasteful lumber, called him fearful of wind. Every other homesteader trusted the frontier rule. If your stove is strong and your walls are solid, you're fine. But Boudreaux spent 2 full days boarding up his 8-foot-deep gallery with vertical planks and battens, turning his summer porch into a sealed winter coat around the cabin. Ezekiel Pratt, the local building authority, openly mocked it as unnecessary work for a man scared to tend his fire properly. Then February arrived. The Arctic outbreak of 1899 sent sub-zero cold straight through Maine, wind that turned small cabin leaks into constant cold air pumps. Pratt's solid cabin with its big stove struggled to hold 52 degrees, burning through firewood every 30 minutes. But Boudreaux's boarded porch created a still air buffer zone that blocked the wind from hitting his cabin walls directly. Same woodpile, same stove, same brutal night. His main room held steady at 72 degrees, a 20-degree difference without changing his fire routine. What did this French-Canadian carpenter understand about wind-driven heat loss that experienced frontiersmen completely missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Night wind rifles the valley like a file on steel. The cabin stove eats split birch like it always does, 1 full firebox load every 45 to 60 minutes. Jean-Baptiste Boudreaux steps outside to check the thermometer hanging on a nail by the door. 52 degrees in the main room. The wind cuts through his wool shirt like it's made of cheesecloth. He moves into the boarded porch. Suddenly, no wind on his face. The air sits still, trapped between the sealed planks and the cabin wall. When he steps back inside after sealing the porch door tight behind him, the thermometer reads 72 degrees. A 20-degree swing without touching the stove routine, without adding a single split of wood to the firebox. This is late 1800s northern border country, where Franco-American settlers brought Quebec building habits south into hard winter homesteads. The gallery was already part of the house pattern, a working porch that served as summer shade and storm shelter, wide, enough for chairs and tools, deep enough to stack cordwood out of the weather. Most families used it exactly that way. Open air 3 seasons, then abandoned to snow and wind when the cold came. Boudreaux isn't a professor or a traveling expert. He's a working builder in a place where winter is a test you either pass or you don't. His hands know the feel of squared timber and the weight of a draw knife. His French-Canadian grandfather taught him that heat is easy to make, but hard to keep. And that wind doesn't care how big your fire is if it can steal the warmth faster than you can replace it. The mockery started in early January when he began measuring lumber for porch panels. Ezekiel Pratt, who'd helped raise more cabins than anyone in the township, watched Boudreaux sort through 1-inch plank boards and shook his head. "Wasting good lumber," Pratt announced to anyone who'd listen. "Making work where there's no work needed." The local building wisdom was simple and confident. If your stove is good, your cabin is good. Feed the fire, split more wood, bank the coals right. Everything else was just fussing. But Boudreaux answered with the old country rule his family had carried south from the St. Lawrence Valley settlements. "Heat is easy to make," he said, his voice dry and matter-of-fact. "It's hard to keep." He'd learned that lesson watching his father battle wind-driven cold in Quebec, where families who ignored infiltration burned twice the wood and still shivered through January nights. The porch footprint measured 8 feet deep by 24 feet long along the front of the cabin, a working gallery you could actually build in and board up properly. Boudreaux had calculated the lumber. 1-inch plank cut to 4-foot sections for handling, plus 1x2 battens to pin every seam tight. He'd need 8-penny to 10-penny nails, enough to secure each plank and batten without splitting the wood. 2 men working steady could cut, hang, batten, and seal the whole thing in 1 long day. His baseline target was simple: keep the living room above 50 degrees overnight without burning double wood. Every frontier family knew that threshold. Below 50, the old folks started coughing and the children's hands went white. Above 50, people could sleep through the night and wake up ready to work. The difference between 50 and 70 degrees wasn't about comfort, it was about survival margin and fuel efficiency. Pratt made sure everyone knew his opinion. Acting scared of wind, he told the men gathered around the store stove. If a man can't tend his fire well enough to keep warm, maybe he shouldn't be living where winter matters. The other builders nodded. They'd all seen families struggle with cold, but the solution was always the same: bigger stove, more wood, better fire discipline. Nobody boarded up a perfectly good porch to hide from weather. Boudreau kept working. He squared the porch opening first, checking posts and rails, adding simple nailers, scrapped 2x4 blocks at corners where the planks needed solid backing. The work wasn't complicated, but it had to be precise. Wind doesn't need a crack you can see to get inside. It needs one you can't see, and it'll find every gap that isn't batten tight. He hung the first skin starting on the windward side, planks going up vertically, tight against each other. Each board got checked with a carpenter's square and nailed off at top and bottom. Then came the battens. 1x2 strips over every joint, 2 nails top and bottom for each batten. The seam schedule was unforgiving. 1 batten every plank joint, no shortcuts, no gaps. At the bottom edge, he left 1/2 inch to 1 inch above the porch deck for drainage, knowing he could bank snow later as a removable gasket when the real cold arrived. And at the house door, he added a second door, a simple frame with canvas flap, so opening the outer porch wouldn't dump cold air straight into the kitchen. The idea was old country practical. Create an airlock so cold air had to fight through 2 barriers instead of rushing directly into the living space. Pratt watched the progress with growing irritation. 2 doors for 1 house, he muttered. Next thing he'll want 3 stoves for 1 room. The other men laughed, but Boudreau just kept nailing battens. He'd learned long ago that when the cold came down hard, the men who laughed loudest in autumn were often the first ones knocking on your door come February. The build sequence demanded precision, not speed. Boudreau knew that winter would test every joint, every seam, every place where wind could find purchase. He started by squaring the porch opening, running his hands along posts and rails to check for gaps or warping. Where the existing frame needed reinforcement, he added simple nailers, scrapped 2x4 blocks at corners, and midpoints where the planks would need solid backing. The first skin went up vertically, each plank positioned tight against its neighbor. Boudreau worked from the windward side, knowing that prevailing northwest winds would hit this wall hardest. Each board got checked with his carpenter's square, then nailed off with 8-penny nails driven through the plank into the frame behind. He set 2 nails at the top, 2 at the bottom, ensuring the wood couldn't twist or cup under weather stress. Once the planks covered the opening, the real work began. Wind doesn't respect tight-fitting boards. It finds the hairline gaps between them and turns those cracks into cold air highways. Boudreau had watched too many builders trust their eye for tight joints, only to discover in February that tight enough wasn't tight enough when Arctic air came calling. The battens went on methodically. Each 1x2 strip covered a plank joint completely, nailed through the batten into both planks beneath. 2 nails at the top, 2 at the bottom of each batten, driven deep enough to bite solid wood, but not so deep as to split the narrow strip. The seam schedule allowed no shortcuts. 1 batten for every plank joint, no exceptions. No places where he convinced himself the boards fit too well to need covering. At the bottom edge, Boudreau left a controlled gap, 1/2 inch to 1 full inch above the porch decking. This wasn't sloppy work. It was drainage insurance. Snow would accumulate against the bottom of the panels, and he wanted that snow to drain away when temperatures fluctuated, not pool against the wood and rot the planks from below. Come deeper winter, he could bank additional snow against that gap, creating a temporary seal that worked with the weather instead of fighting it. The physics behind the method were straightforward, though most frontier builders had never thought about them systematically. Wind increased heat loss in 2 distinct ways. First, it stripped warm air directly off surfaces through convection, the same principle that made a hot coal glow brighter, when you blew on it. Second, and more dangerously, it drove cold air through leaks in the building envelope through infiltration. Even tiny gaps became significant when 30-mile-per-hour winds pushed frigid air through every crack in the cabin walls. Building models used by engineers recognized infiltration as both wind-driven and temperature-driven, but wind speed mattered enormously. A calm night at 10 below zero was manageable. The same temperature with 20-mile-per-hour winds could overwhelm even a well-built cabin's heating capacity. The boarded gallery attacked this problem at its source. Instead of asking the cabin walls to resist wind directly, it gave the wind something else to fight first. The porch skin would take the brunt of wind pressure, creating a buffer zone of still air between the outer planks and the cabin proper. Still air was nature's cheapest insulator. 8 feet of sheltered porch depth would act as a thermal coat around the living space, and that coat would cost nothing to maintain once the initial construction was complete. The door control system required its own careful attention. Boudreau framed a simple outer door at the porch entrance, then added a second barrier at the threshold to the house itself, a canvas flap on a wooden frame that could swing freely but created an additional seal. The two-door sequence would reduce what builders called the blast effect, the rush of cold air that flooded a warm room every time someone opened the door during a storm. Testing for air leaks became a nightly ritual as the work progressed. Boudreau lit a candle and moved it slowly along every seam, every batten edge, every place where different pieces of wood came together. If the flame flickered sideways, air was moving through the joint. If it stayed steady and upright, the seal was holding. He marked problem spots with chalk and returned to them the next morning with additional nails or caulking compound mixed from pine pitch and sawdust. Marie Leblanc, who managed seasonal routines for 3 households in the settlement, watched the progress with approval. She understood the domestic side of winter management: fuel planning, draft control, the practical difference between a house that held heat and one that leaked warmth faster than the stove could replace it. "The best improvements work every day without heroics," she told her neighbors. "Block the wind, control the door openings, keep the living space steady." She explained the principle in terms any household manager could grasp. The closed-in porch would make a still air wrap around the cabin, so winter storms would fight the outer boards instead of the living room walls. The method wasn't complex, but it required understanding that stopping heat loss mattered as much as making heat in the first place. Boudreau's predicted savings were modest but significant. If cutting infiltration reduced the stove's workload, he expected 25 to 40%. Fewer reloads on windy nights. Over a full winter, that difference would add up to several cords of split wood, enough saved fuel to justify the lumber cost and the 2 days of careful construction. More importantly, the system would provide a safety margin during the worst weather, when families needed their heating systems to work reliably without constant attention. The final details mattered most. Latch hardware had to work smoothly, even when ice formed on metal surfaces. Hinges needed protection from direct weather exposure. The outer door required a simple but effective seal around its perimeter, strips of leather or felt that would compress when the door closed, creating a continuous barrier against wind infiltration. By late January, the boarded gallery was complete. 8 feet deep, 24 feet long, sealed tight with battened seams and controlled ventilation. The structure looked solid and purposeful, like a winter coat tailored specifically for the cabin it surrounded. Word traveled through the settlement in the way that weather news always did. Casual mentions at the general store, fragments of conversation overheard at the mill, worried looks exchanged between women who managed household fuel supplies. A brutal cold wave was building somewhere to the northwest, the kind that would test every cabin, every stove, every family's preparation for the hardest part of winter. Some folks shrugged off the warnings. February was always cold, and they'd survived plenty of hard nights before. Others began to panic late, suddenly realizing their wood piles might not stretch through an extended freeze, scrambling to split more fuel or borrow from better-prepared neighbors. Ezekiel Pratt fell into the first category, confident in his experience, dismissive of what he called weather gossip from nervous women and old-timers who'd forgotten how to tend a proper fire. Boudreau finished the last seam battens with quiet determination, checking each joint twice and testing the latch lines on both doors. He wasn't a man given to dramatics or predictions, but he understood the arithmetic of fuel consumption in wind-driven cold. His sealed gallery would either prove itself worthy of the lumber and labor he'd invested, or it would stand as an expensive reminder that even careful planning couldn't guarantee results. The crisis that arrived had a name and a date that weather records would preserve: the February 1899 Arctic outbreak. An enormous high-pressure system pushed south and east from the Canadian territories, carrying air so cold and dense that it displaced the normal winter patterns across New England. The National Weather Service would later describe it as one of the most significant cold outbreaks in United States history, with sub-zero temperatures extending through Maine and staying locked in place for days. This wasn't the kind of cold that frontier families could manage with extra blankets and hot tea. It was cold that killed. Cold that overwhelmed heating systems, froze water indoors, and turned small building flaws into life-threatening problems. Normal cabins didn't fail because their logs disappeared or their foundations cracked. They failed because wind turned minor air leaks into constant cold air pumps, forcing stoves to work beyond their sustainable capacity, while families burned through fuel reserves at unsustainable rates. The temperature dropped steadily through the first week of February, then plummeted as the Arctic air mass settled over northern Maine. Boudreau recorded the outdoor readings with the methodical attention of a man who understood that knowledge was survival. 20 below, then 30 below, holding steady in the deepest cold he'd experienced in 15 years of frontier winters. In conventional cabins throughout the settlement, the signs of thermal failure appeared with grim predictability. Frost formed on nail heads where metal conducted cold through the walls. Smoke backdrafted down chimneys when wind pressure overwhelmed the natural draft that kept fires burning cleanly. Water pails that had never frozen indoors began developing thin skins of ice near the walls, a sure sign that interior temperatures were dropping toward dangerous levels. Sarah and Thomas Reed, newer arrivals from a milder climate, discovered that their confidence in standard cabin practice had been misplaced. Their solid log walls and substantial iron stove couldn't maintain comfortable temperatures when every gap between the logs became a pathway for Arctic air. Thomas found himself reloading the firebox every 30 to 40 minutes during the worst wind, burning through their carefully rationed fuel supply at twice the expected rate. The wind was the killer. It didn't just make the air feel colder, it actively stripped heat from surfaces and drove frigid air through building envelopes with relentless efficiency. A cabin that could hold 60 degrees on a calm night at 20 below might struggle to reach 50 degrees when wind pushed that same cold air through every unsealed joint and crack. Boudreau's sealed gallery changed the fundamental equation. The wind hit his outer planks with full force, but those planks were sacrificial, designed to take punishment while protecting the still air buffer zone behind them. Inside that 8-foot deep pocket, the air sat calm and relatively warm, insulated from the cutting wind that was overwhelming his neighbors' heating systems. The contrast became visible in practical details that any frontier resident could recognize. While Pratt's cabin showed frost patterns on the interior walls where cold spots formed near leaks, Boudreau's main room stayed consistently warm enough that condensation never reached the freezing point. Where neighbors found their water buckets skimming over with ice despite burning wood constantly, his kitchen maintained temperatures that kept household water liquid through the night. The stove routine told the story most clearly. Pratt, with his experience and confidence, found himself feeding split birch every 30 minutes during the peak wind, struggling to maintain barely adequate interior temperatures while his fuel supply dwindled at an alarming rate. His big iron stove, adequate for normal winter conditions, couldn't compete with the constant infiltration that turned his solid cabin walls into a sieve for Arctic air. Boudreau's stove maintained its regular 45 to 60-minute feeding cycle, the same firebox, burning the same split birch, in the same cabin design, but protected by 8 feet of still air that blocked the wind from stealing heat faster than the fire could replace it. The boarded gallery had turned his heating system from a desperate battle against infiltration into a manageable routine of steady fuel consumption. Father Ouellette, making his rounds to check on parishioners during the worst of the cold, began to notice which households were struggling and which were holding steady. His records, kept for parish assistance purposes, would later show a clear pattern. Families whose cabins fought wind directly consumed fuel at unsustainable rates and required community support to avoid dangerous cold exposure, while those few who had found ways to control infiltration maintained safe interior conditions without exhausting their resources. The night that would test every theory and prove every method was approaching, with temperatures predicted to drop even further and wind speeds that would challenge the structural integrity of buildings throughout the region. The night of February 9th brought the field test that would validate or demolish every theory about wind, infiltration, and frontier heating. Boudreau moved methodically through his evening routine, recording measurements with the careful attention of a man who understood that data mattered more than opinion. The outdoor thermometer read 32 below zero. Wind speeds, judged by sound and the behavior of smoke from neighboring chimneys, were running 25 to 30 miles per hour with stronger gusts. He stepped into his sealed gallery to check the interior thermometer that had become the center of the settlement's winter debate. Before the porch modifications, this same measurement point had consistently shown 52 degrees during similar weather conditions, adequate for survival, but requiring constant fire tending and heavy fuel consumption. Tonight, with the boarded walls blocking wind from reaching the cabin proper, the thermometer held steady at 72 degrees. 20 degrees warmer with the same woodpile, the same iron stove, the same feeding schedule that had barely maintained livable conditions in previous winters. The mechanism was exactly what building science would later quantify precisely. Wind-driven infiltration was the primary thief of interior heat, and the gallery had created a thermal buffer that stopped that theft at the outer envelope. The still air trapped between his planked walls and the cabin acted as an insulating layer worth several inches of solid wood, but without the weight, expense, or structural complexity of actually thickening every wall. Secondary benefits appeared throughout the night as the storm intensified. The interior air stayed drier because the constant infiltration of frigid outside air, which carried almost no moisture and forced heating systems to work harder while creating uncomfortable humidity swings, had been dramatically reduced. Windows showed less condensation, and the sharp temperature gradients that created cold spots near walls and floors were moderated by the stable thermal envelope. The contrast with neighboring cabins was stark and measurable. Thomas Reed's solid log construction, following every conventional wisdom about frontier building, struggled to maintain 48 degrees despite burning split wood every 35 minutes. The family huddled near the stove in layers of wool blankets, rationing their movements to avoid exposure to the cold zones that had formed near the outer walls. Their water bucket, positioned just 6 feet from the fire, developed a skim of ice that Thomas had to break each time he needed to fill the coffee pot. Ezekiel Pratt, the settlement's acknowledged expert on cabin heating, faced his own crisis of confidence. His large stove, fed with seasoned hardwood every half hour, couldn't lift his main room above 51 degrees. Frost formed on the interior surfaces of nails and metal hinges, and his carefully banked coals required constant attention to prevent them from being overwhelmed by the drafts that seemed to find every gap in his log chinking. For a man who had built his reputation on understanding fire management and wood consumption, the night revealed gaps in his knowledge that no amount of experience could fill. The knock came at 20 minutes past, midnight, 3 sharp raps that cut through the wind noise with the urgency of desperation. Boudreau opened his outer door to find Thomas Reed supporting his wife, Sarah, both of them shivering despite heavy coats and wool scarves. Behind them stood their 8-year-old daughter, coughing with the dry hack that frontier families recognized as the first sign of dangerous cold exposure. "Stove can't keep up," Thomas said through chattering teeth. "Child's hands are going white, and we're burning wood faster than we can split it. Can you spare room by your fire?" The request was both practical and desperate, an admission that conventional methods had failed when they were needed most. Boudreau didn't lecture or remind anyone of the mockery his sealed porch had received. He opened the inner door and gestured them toward the warmth that his system had maintained without strain. "Wind doesn't care if you meant well," he said quietly, the closest he would come to claiming vindication. The statement carried the weight of hard-won knowledge and the understated confidence of a man whose methods had passed the only test that mattered. Inside the main room, the Reed family experienced the difference immediately. The air temperature of 72 degrees felt luxurious after hours of struggling with marginal warmth, but more importantly, the absence of cold drafts allowed their bodies to retain heat instead of fighting a constant battle against infiltration. The child's coughing subsided within an hour as she warmed thoroughly for the first time in days. Boudreau showed Thomas the construction details without ceremony, the battened seams that had prevented air leaks, the double door system that controlled cold air entry, the simple but effective approach to turning wind from an enemy into a problem for the outer envelope rather than the living space. The method wasn't mysterious or complex, but it required understanding that heat retention mattered as much as heat. Generation in extreme conditions. The safety measurements that night told the story in terms any frontier family could understand. Water stayed liquid above 32 degrees in Boudreau's kitchen, while freezing solid in drafty cabins throughout the settlement. His fuel consumption remained sustainable, one full firebox load every 55 minutes, while neighbors burned through their winter reserves at rates that threatened their ability to survive until spring. 2 additional families sought shelter before dawn, their own heating systems overwhelmed by the combination of extreme cold and relentless wind. Boudreau's sealed gallery, designed for one household, accommodated 7 people that night without strain. The 20-degree thermal advantage had created not just comfort, but genuine survival margin, the difference between a close call and a tragedy that would have required community support and emergency fuel sharing. By morning, the wind had moderated, but the temperature remained brutally low. The settlement began the process of assessing damage, counting costs, and evaluating which methods had proven themselves worthy of adoption. The laughter that had greeted Boudreau's boarded porch in January was notably absent from the conversations around the general store. Men who had mocked his excessive preparation now asked practical questions about lumber requirements, batten schedules, and sealing techniques. By the following cold season, the transformation was complete and undeniable. Men who had openly mocked Boudreau's boarded gallery were quietly measuring lumber and calculating batten requirements for their own porches. Ezekiel Pratt, whose authority had crumbled during the February crisis, became one of the most systematic adopters, spending 3 days in October carefully sealing his own porch with vertical planks and methodical attention to joint coverage. The community standard had shifted without fanfare or formal acknowledgement. The gallery stopped being viewed as just summer shade and became recognized as a seasonal system, a winter coat that could be installed each fall and removed each spring. Families began planning their autumn work around porch closure, treating it as essential preparation alongside wood splitting and root cellar stocking. Thomas Reed, whose family had survived the worst night in Boudreau's sealed cabin, became the most vocal advocate for the method. He spent the late summer of 1899 building an 8-foot-deep addition to his own cabin, specifically designed for seasonal boarding. His construction followed Boudreau's specifications exactly. Vertical planks with 1x2 battens over every seam, double-door airlock system, and controlled gap at the bottom for drainage and temporary snow banking. Marie Leblanc documented the adoption process with the practical eye of a household manager who understood seasonal labor allocation. By her count, most houses within a day's travel had copied the method by the second winter following the Arctic outbreak. The technique spread not through formal instruction or written plans, but through the frontier community's pragmatic evaluation of what worked and what didn't when survival was at stake. The mathematics of fuel savings became common knowledge among families who had tested both approaches. Households reported cutting their wood consumption by 25 to 40% during wind events, with the greatest savings occurring during the prolonged cold snaps that had previously forced families to burn through their reserves at unsustainable rates. Over a full winter, this difference typically amounted to 3 to 5 cords of split wood, enough saved fuel to justify the initial lumber investment and the annual labor of seasonal installation. Father Ouellette's parish records reflected the change in measurable terms. Emergency requests for fuel assistance dropped significantly in the winters following widespread adoption of sealed galleries. Families who had previously required community support during extended cold periods were maintaining adequate heat without depleting their reserves. The number of cold-related illnesses, particularly among children and elderly residents, showed a marked decline in households that had implemented effective infiltration control. The construction details became standardized through trial and practical refinement. Most builders settled on 1-inch planks cut to 4-foot lengths for manageable handling. Battening every seam remained non-negotiable. No builder who had experienced a failure during high winds ever skipped joint coverage again. The typical labor allocation was 1 day for 2 men to close a gallery in fall, and half a day to remove and stack the boards in spring. Durability proved excellent when proper materials were used, and boards were kept dry during storage. Porch panels that were stacked off the ground with air circulation could be reused for 5 to 10 winters without significant deterioration. The investment in quality lumber and careful construction paid dividends over multiple seasons, making the method economically sustainable for families with limited cash resources. The knowledge transmission followed patterns typical of frontier communities where practical skills spread through demonstration rather than formal instruction. Experienced builders like Boudreau found themselves teaching ceiling techniques to younger men, emphasizing the critical details that separated effective installations from marginal ones. The candle flame test for air leaks became standard practice, and builders developed rules of thumb for batten spacing, nail schedules, and door sealing that could be applied reliably without engineering calculations. Local lumber suppliers noticed the seasonal demand for specific materials, 1-inch plank stock and batten strips in particular, and began stocking accordingly. The economic impact rippled through the settlement as families invested in thermal improvements that paid for themselves through reduced fuel consumption. Sawmill operators reported steady autumn orders for porch boarding materials, creating a predictable seasonal market that hadn't existed before. The February crisis demonstrated the value of infiltration control. The method's success attracted attention from builders in neighboring townships, who arrived to examine the installations and question residents about construction details and performance results. The knowledge spread along the informal networks that connected frontier communities, carried by traveling craftsmen, visiting relatives, and the gradual migration of families who brought proven techniques to new locations. Modern building science would eventually validate the principles that Boudreau had applied through traditional knowledge and careful observation. Buffer spaces like sunrooms and enclosed porches were recognized as effective strategies for reducing heat loss and managing airflow between interior and exterior environments. The still air insulation principle that made his gallery effective became incorporated into wall design and construction standards throughout cold climates. The broader lesson transcended the specific technique. Frontier builders discovered that survival wasn't just about individual resilience or superior equipment. It was about understanding the physical principles that governed heat transfer, air movement, and building performance under extreme conditions. The men who had initially dismissed Boudreau's approach as excessive or fearful learned that effective preparation often appeared unnecessary until the moment when it became essential. The design rule that emerged from the community's experience was deceptively simple but absolutely firm. Battens on every seam, no shortcuts, no places where builders convinced themselves that tight-fitting boards didn't need coverage. This rule, passed down through practical demonstration and repeated success, ensured that new installations would perform reliably when tested by the next severe weather event. Boudreau's quiet vindication came not through praise or recognition, but through the adoption of his methods by the same neighbors who had questioned his judgment. The sealed gallery became part of the settlement's standard practice, as routine and uncontroversial as banking coals or splitting kindling. In real winter, the smartest heat you make is the heat you keep.